You were clear, not harsh, not demanding, just clear. You said what you meant. You asked direct questions. You explained yourself without raising your voice. You didn't accuse. You didn't hint. Nothing about it was aggressive. You weren't asking for more than what was already being discussed. From the outside, it looked reasonable. You stayed calm. You used simple words. You didn't push. Still, something shifted when you spoke that way. The room changed. The tone cooled. The response slowed. You noticed it immediately, even if nothing was said. You were told you were intense, or difficult, or overthinking. Sometimes you were told you were making things bigger than they needed to be. You checked yourself. You replayed what you said. You looked for sharp edges. You didn't find any. You hadn't attacked anyone. You hadn't crossed a line. You had just been clear. And that was the moment things stopped feeling neutral. You noticed how clarity landed. You would state something plainly, what you needed, what you understood, what you didn't. You weren't adding emotion. You weren't asking for agreement. You were just putting words where there had been space. The response was rarely direct. Sometimes it came as silence, a pause that stretched longer than expected. Other times it came as a soft change of subject, or a suggestion that this didn't need to be talked about right now. You noticed how often your words were reframed, not repeated, adjusted, smoothed out, made smaller, as if what you said needed translation before it could be accepted. You were told things like, "Let's not overcomplicate this," or "Why are you making it so serious?" or "Can't we just keep this light?" You hadn't raised the stakes. You had named them. You noticed how clarity changed the mood, how ease disappeared when things were said plainly, how tension appeared even though no one was upset. You began to see which kinds of sentences slowed things down, questions with edges, statements without cushioning, anything that removed ambiguity. Nothing bad happened right away, no argument, no confrontation, just a subtle shift, a cooling, a sense that something had gone slightly off script. You noticed that clarity was treated differently than confusion. Confusion was allowed. Clarity was managed. You watched this happen more than once, enough times to recognize it, not enough times to confront it. Each moment could be explained on its own. Bad timing, stress, a misunderstanding. But the feeling was consistent. When you were clear, things got harder. The same pattern kept returning. You would speak clearly, not forcefully, not emotionally, just clearly. And the response would arrive sideways. It might come as humor, a joke that lightened the moment, or as reassurance that everything was fine, or as a reminder to relax. The point you made would drift, not argued against, just left behind. You noticed how often clarity was treated as a disruption, as if it introduced weight where none was wanted, as if it changed the atmosphere by existing. Over time, you learned what happened next. If you stayed clear, things slowed down, conversations stalled, energy dropped. People seemed less comfortable. If you softened, things moved again. You saw this more than once, enough times to stop doubting it, not enough times to call it out. The rules were never spoken, but they were reliable. Clarity brought friction, ambiguity kept things smooth. You began to notice how much effort went into keeping things unspoken, how often clarity was redirected toward tone instead of content. You weren't told you were wrong. You were told you were difficult, or intense, or too serious. The words changed. The meaning didn't. Each instance was small, each one easy to excuse, but together they formed something familiar. Being clear made you the problem, and that kept repeating. You started changing how you spoke. Not all at once, quietly. You added soft words around clear ones. You asked questions instead of making statements. You explained your reasons before anyone asked for them. You learned to slow down your clarity, to introduce it carefully, to check the room before finishing a sentence. You told yourself this was normal. People communicate differently. You were just being considerate. You stopped saying certain things the first time you thought them. You waited. You tested the moment. Sometimes you decided it wasn't worth it. You noticed how often you translated yourself, how often you took something simple and made it easier for others to hear. When something felt unclear, you didn't name it right away. You gave it time. You let it sit. You didn't want to cause tension where there didn't need to be any. You became skilled at smoothing edges, at keeping things light, at making sure clarity didn't sound like a challenge. None of this felt forced. No one told you to do it. You chose it because it seemed to work. Things moved more easily when you did. Conversations flowed. The atmosphere stayed comfortable. So you kept adjusting. You didn't think of it as losing anything. You thought of it as being flexible, as being aware, as being good at reading situations. You were still clear, just not all the way. And over time, that became the version of yourself that showed up first. Something started to wear on you. Not sharply, gradually. You noticed how much energy clarity took now. Not the speaking of it, the preparation, the softening, the checking. You would think through a sentence before saying it, then think through it again. You wanted to be understood without being seen as difficult. You felt a delay between knowing something and saying it. Sometimes the delay stayed so long that the moment passed. You became more aware of reactions than of your own thoughts. You watched faces. You listened for tone shifts. You adjusted in real time. You felt responsible for how things landed. Even when you had been careful, even when you had done nothing wrong. You noticed a quiet tension in your body, a holding, a sense of bracing before speaking. It wasn't fear, it was effort. You began to question your own clarity, not whether it was accurate, whether it was worth it. You wondered if you were too direct, too serious, too much. You wondered if it would be easier to stay vague. Clarity used to feel simple. Now it felt heavy. You didn't name this as a loss. You told yourself you were adapting. You told yourself this was maturity. But something was being spent. You felt less present in conversations, less grounded in yourself. You felt the gap between what you knew and what you allowed yourself to say. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing broke, but you were carrying more than before, and you hadn't called it a cost. You noticed how often you stayed quiet even when you had something clear to say, not because it wasn't true, because it felt like work. You would feel the impulse to speak, then feel the effort required to do it. The explaining, the softening, the watching. Sometimes the effort outweighed the need, so you let moments pass. You told yourself it wasn't important. You told yourself it could wait. You told yourself clarity didn't always need a voice. But the moments kept adding up. You noticed how rarely you spoke without planning anymore, how rarely words came out without being shaped first. You missed the ease of saying something and trusting it to stand. You felt less solid inside yourself, not lost, just less anchored, as if your thoughts were always waiting for permission before becoming real. You noticed how relief came not when things were clear, but when nothing needed to be said at all. That was new. You weren't choosing silence because it felt right. You were choosing it because clarity felt costly. And you were paying that cost, quietly. There was one thing you could no longer ignore. Being clear had stopped feeling neutral. You weren't confused about what you thought. You weren't unsure about what you meant. The clarity was still there, intact. What had changed was how safe it felt to use it. You noticed how often you held back something simple, not because it was wrong, because you had learned what it would cost. You had learned that clarity changed the room, that it slowed things down, that it made you visible in a way that wasn't welcome. You hadn't been asked to stop being clear. You had been shown. So you adapted, you softened, you waited. You chose ease over accuracy more often than you meant to. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing exploded. No one said this directly, but the truth stayed consistent. When you were unclear, things flowed. When you were clear, things tightened. That wasn't about communication style, it wasn't about tone. It was about what clarity revealed. And at some point, you realized something simple. Your clarity wasn't the problem. It was being treated like one. When clarity was treated as a problem,